So today we're going to talk, the title of today's panel is Reef, Rubbish, and Reason, and we're going to talk a little bit about coral reef, almost as a platform to talk broader about kind of the interplay between science and art and how to engage people into having ecological consciousness through different types of art projects, including the Crochet Coral Reef project that we're going to be talking about today. Just a brief background about coral reef, and I'm sure John here is going to be able to talk much more eloquently than I am, but coral reef have been devastated by pollution, by global warming, by ocean acidification, and scientists are trying to find new ways to preserve these vital organisms in these rapid changing environments that we are encountering here. Especially here in this region, there are many issues with extreme warm temperatures of the oceans and high salt concentrations that leads to the bleaching of these coral reefs. So we'll hear John talk a little bit about that afterwards. But in addition to that, this brings us into a discussion about how to engage people socially, but also through visual art in bringing awareness about these different types of ecological disasters. And we're going to hear today from Margaret, who's going to talk a little bit about this Crochet Coral Reef project, and talk a little bit broadly. We'll broaden this discussion to talk a little bit about the interplay between science and art and how to communicate science through narrative, through poetry, through film, and talk a little bit about how this is done with our panelists today. So I'm going to just introduce myself. My name is Alexis Gambis. I am a visiting professor here in biology, film, and new media. I share my time between the film department and the biology department. I have a PhD in molecular biology and genetics, but I also make films about science and try to find new ways of bringing science into narrative filmmaking. I am the founder and artistic director of an organization based in New York, a nonprofit known as Imagine Science Films, which hosts an annual film festival, which is all about bringing science to the public through documentary, fiction, experimental film. And actually, the 7th edition is going to start in about 2 weeks in New York. If anybody's in New York, it starts on October 17th and happens all for 8 days all around New York, and we have about 89 films. So I am going to give a brief introduction to all of our panelists today and thank them for being here. I know some of them just arrived yesterday. And then we're going to each one of the panelists is going to give a brief presentation, and then this will lead into a broader conversation. And I urge everybody here in the audience to ask as many questions as possible so that we have a lively discussion afterwards. So we're going to start here with Margaret Wertheim, who's a science writer, curator, and artist in Los Angeles. She is the director for the Institute for Figuring, a Los Angeles nonprofit she founded with her twin sister, Christine, to promote public engagement with the aesthetic and poetic dimensions of science and mathematics. Through the Institute for Figuring, Margaret has created exhibitions and different participatory art and science programs. I'm going to just name a few. She's had exhibits at the Hayward Gallery in London, the Science Gallery in Dublin, the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, the Smithsonian National Museum. And through her work, she tries to evoke or kind of activate responses about gender imbalance, and she communicates science to women and tries to bring awareness about that importance of science outreach. And she is a pioneer throughout her career in communicating science in general. And this project here, the Crochet Coral Reef project, has been the result of about a decade, is that correct, of work. She has spoken about it in length. I don't know if some of you have seen her TED Talk, which has been viewed by over 1 million people and translated into 20 different languages. And also Margaret is known for many books that explore cultural history of physics. So thank you so much, Margaret, for being here today. Then we have, right next to Margaret, we have Lawrence Weschler, who for over 20 years was a staff writer at The New Yorker, where his work shuttled between political tragedies and cultural comedies. He is also the director emeritus of the New York Institute for the Humanities at NYU, where he was the director from 2001 to 2013. He's also the artistic director emeritus, still actively engaged with the Chicago Humanities Festival, and curator for the New York Live Ideals Festival. He is known for his work in literary nonfiction, including political reportages, just to name a few of his books: Passions and Wonders series, Seeing is Forgotten, The Name of the Thing One Sees, A Life of Contemporary Artist Robert Irwin, Mr. Wilson's Cabinet of Wonder, his latest collection, Uncanny Valley, adventures in the narrative. Weschler has taught in various institutions, Princeton, Columbia, USC, Bard, which I happen to have gone to, Vassar, Sarah Lawrence at NYU. And just as a side note, he used to be the curator of an amazing DVD quarterly series known as Wolfen, if any of you have heard of it. He also was the chair of the Sundance Documentary Film Fund, and he recently launched Pillow of Air, a monthly amble through the worlds of visual column in The Believer. And actually, in connection to Margaret's work, he's also a contributing editor among a few different reviews of the Virgin and Quarterly Review, in which he wrote an article entitled Hyperbolic Crochet Coral Reef Project. And finally, we have John Burt, who's a marine biologist and one of ours here at NYU Abu Dhabi. He uses the Arabian Gulf as his laboratory to study coral reef ecology, and especially how these coral reef adapt in these very harsh conditions here in the environments. He uses it as a model to study the possible impacts of future climate change on reefs elsewhere in the world. His current research examines coral communities in these extreme environments, how they recover, how they respond to mass bleaching events, and how variation in environmental conditions affect the patterns of these communities and the structures of these coral reefs. He's also very much engaged in the region. He's the organizer of the recent Coral Reef of the Gulf Conference that happened in 2012 and brought together regional and international scientists from 19 different countries who are studying marine systems in the Gulf. And he is the co-founder of the Mid-East Coral Reef Society, which was initiated in 2013. In addition to his research, John is very active here on campus as an academic. He he was one of the pioneers in starting the Foundations of Science program and exploring ways of creating cross-disciplinary curriculums in science and engineering. He teaches courses in ecology and biodiversity, and two of his courses that he teaches here that are very popular are the Desert Life in an Arid Environment, and the one that he's teaching, is it next semester? The one about
next semester.
Where the City Meets the Sea, Ecological Implications of Coastal Urbanization. Thank you all for being here today. So we're going to start with Margaret, and each of our presenters has a few slides that they're going to be using for the rest of this talk. So Margaret.
So my name's Margaret Wertheim, and I'm the co-creator of the Crochet Coral Reef project that is on exhibit out in the foyer. So I want to just give you a very brief overview of the project and how I think it brings together art and science in ways that I think have messages and resonances for environmental concerns. So the project, we are crocheting a coral reef, and it's a project that my sister and I started 9 years ago in our Los Angeles living room. And we have been crocheting these reefs with people all over the world during that last 9 years. So we've been crocheting these coral reefs with people all over the world, and it's a project that resides at the intersection of art, science, mathematics, and environmentalism. And the reason it's a mathematical project is because all of these frilly crenellated forms that you see in coral reefs are actually biological manifestations of a kind of geometry called hyperbolic geometry, which is an alternative to the Euclidean geometry we learn about at school. So you immediately recognize these as coral forms because what we're doing here is crocheting representations of this geometry. So here are actually real living corals, and you can see they have these hyperbolic structures. And it turns out that although marine organisms have been making these forms for the last 400 or 500 million years, and here are some nudibranchs doing it, humans didn't have any way to represent these structures until the late 1990s, when a mathematician at Cornell, Dr. Diana Taimina, figured out that she could crochet them. And so my sister and I started playing around with this about 10 years ago, and we gradually started branching out and making them sort of not mathematically perfect like the ones Dr. Taimina had made. And as we branched out and made them more kind of wild, they began to look like natural corals. So we decided in the end of 2005 that we could crochet a coral reef. And my sister likes to remind me that she said it in the conditional tense. We could crochet a coral reef. And in fact, we have been crocheting a coral reef. And one of the things that's happened over time is that the gradual, as it were, crochet coral ecologies have got more and more diverse. So just as life on Earth starts from very simple seeds and gradually evolves into a more complex tree of life, so that you start with simple single-cell organisms and eventually you get peacocks and elephants and redwoods, so too the crochet coral ecology has gone through an evolutionary process so that we get ever more complex and diversified crochet coral landscapes. The project is also a huge community art project. We have now had more than approximately 8,000 people all over the world join us in doing this project. We've done it in 35 cities and countries around the world, from New York and London to Sydney and Melbourne, Latvia and Ireland, and now here in Abu Dhabi in the Middle East. We've had exhibitions in both science museums and art galleries around the world, including the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the Hayward Gallery in London, Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. That's just to give you a sense of the diversity of the venues where we have been showing. As I said, there have been at least 8,000 people around the world who've participated in this, and more than 2 million people have seen the resulting exhibitions. This gives you some sense of the scale of what some of the community reefs can be. Here in Abu Dhabi, there have been, I think there was 50 or 60 local people participated in making that gorgeous local community reef that you see out there. In some of the venues that we've done this project, we've had up to almost 1,000 people collaborate on making the local reef. At the Smithsonian, for instance, when we did it there, they had over 900 people, including participants from all 50 United States and 20 other countries. But the reason we're doing the project is to bring attention to the fact that coral reefs all over the world are dying out. Coral reefs are very delicate organisms. Reefs are made by tiny little coral polyps that are little things about this big. On their own, they're brainless and pretty much powerless. But together in their collectivity, in the billions of them working together, they build the barrier reef, the Great Barrier Reef, and other magnificent reef structures. But these fabulous structures are under threat, traditionally from global warming and pollution, agricultural runoff, and illegal toxic dumping. But now they're also being stressed by ocean acidification and the warming of sea temperatures, both of which are byproducts of all the CO2 we humans are pumping into the atmosphere. And it has been theorized, and John will talk about this at length, that there is a possibility that if we humans don't change our ways, by mid-century, coral reefs may no longer be able to form, and it's possible that this century, coral reefs may be decimated altogether. We see the Crochet Reef project as a positive response to this dilemma. When we started the project, our initial aim was simply to highlight the problem through the process of making something beautiful. We wanted to give people a way into discussing this really quite terrifying problem. But something has happened over the course of the project that we didn't expect, that to us, to Christine and I, has become a metaphor. And that is the thing that just as coral polyps, individual tiny creatures, can do nothing much on their own, but when they come together in their multitudes, they can build something like the Great Barrier Reef, which is the first living thing that can be seen from outer space. So too, when we humans come together, we too have immense power in our collectivity. And the reefs that various communities have made, this is the Smithsonian Reef, have been made, as I said, by up to 1,000 people, are, as it were, a metaphor for the power of collective human action. And this has been a surprise to us. We did not set out to, as it were, emulate the process of living reefs, but that's what's happened. And gradually, I think, what has come to the forefront in this project is that effectively, I think it can serve as a metaphor that we humans might feel powerless as individuals. Indeed, we are powerless as individuals. But together, we can do amazing things. And together, I believe, we are capable of solving the problem of global warming and ocean acidification. So in a way, what we are left with this project is the beautiful thought that in a very real way, we are all polyps now. We humans, we too are at risk, along with these magnificent creatures. And if we don't change our action, we will all be decimated along with them. But together, we may actually be able to achieve fundamental global change. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been tasked with talking a bit more generally about the work of artists, the extent to which artists can be active in this whole terrain of global warming generally and other things. And it brings to mind a remarkable paragraph that the great New Yorker writer Jonathan Schell, my old colleague, just died a few months ago. Back in 1982, many of you will remember, he wrote this incredible text, The Fate of the Earth, which was about the threat of nuclear weapons at the time. And in much the way that the abolitionist movement back in the mid-19th century led directly to the feminist movement later in the 19th century, the anti-nuclear weapons movement led directly into the ecological and environmentalist movement, and they're related to each other. At the time, and this is 1982, when Ronald Reagan was trying to force Pershing missiles on Europe, and there was a danger there was going to be an incredible arms race kicking off. Eventually, 1 million people were in Central Park a few months after this piece appeared, objecting to that. In any case, he wrote the following paragraph at the end of The Fate of the Earth. "Two paths lie before us. One leads to death, the other to life. If we choose the first path, we in effect become the allies of death, and in everything we do, our attachment to life will weaken. Our vision, blinded to the abyss that has opened at our feet, will dim and grow confused. Our will, discouraged by the thought of trying to build on such precarious foundation anything that is meant to last, will slacken, and we will sink into stupefaction, as though we were gradually weaning ourselves from life in preparation for the end. On the other hand, if we reject our doom and bend our efforts towards survival, then the anesthetic fog will lift. Our vision, no longer straining not to see the obvious, will sharpen. Our will, finding secure ground to build on, will be restored, and we will take full and clear possession of life again. One day, and it is hard to believe that it will not be soon, we will have to make our choice." And it seems to me that he nails it exactly, that the crisis earlier with regard to nuclear weapons, and by the way, it's worth remembering, sidelight to all this, there are still tens of thousands of nuclear weapons around, and that's something we have to deal with, but we'll put that to the side for right now. But that what we're talking about is a crisis of vision, of being able to see. And not only being able to see, but to stop not seeing. And the people who work on vision are artists. That's their role. That's their profession. So it's natural that artists of various sorts should be called upon as very important in this whole thing. I wanted to just give you an example of one particular artwork. I mean, it goes without saying that I just think and I've written about this at length, that the project that Margaret and her thousands of fellow polyps have been engaged upon is incredibly important in this regard. But I wanted to show you another one, because it seems to me that precisely the task at hand is to wake ourselves up to how we've been sleepwalking. And there was a tremendous event in Denmark just a few months after Fate of the Earth appeared at the Louisiana Museum. I don't know if any of you, how many people have been to the Louisiana Museum in Denmark? Any of you? Oh, well, well, let me just say a factual statement that it is the most beautiful art museum in the world. That'll be on the test. What is the most beautiful art museum in the world? Louisiana Museum in Denmark, 10 points. And it's located, as you enter it, you enter through this kind, like going to grandma's house. There's this house that you enter, and then you get out the back side of the house on this gorgeous lawn, this vast lawn, overlooking the Sound. This is about half an hour north of Copenhagen on the way to Elsinore. And the Sound in question is the narrowest point, it's the choke point between Denmark and Sweden. And you can see it goes down the hill to the beach down below. The founder of the museum, and I'm not showing you all the other parts of it, but the museum, one of the things that's beautiful about it is it's into the terrain, so you don't really, it doesn't block view and so forth. But you can see how it slopes down. In any case, the founder of the museum is this wonderful character named Knud Jensen, that's him. And he felt that he had spent an incredible amount of energy creating this museum, this emporium. It goes off on both sides here. Thousands and thousands of works of art, contemporary art, Giacometti. One of the things that was fascinating about this museum, by the way, is it was so beloved that whenever he had a show of Henry Moore, of Giacometti, of Morris Louis, of anybody, the artist would just say, well, here, just keep all these works. And there's a tremendous number of gorgeous things there. In any case, he felt that he'd spent many, many years doing this, and that it was therefore his curatorial responsibility to make sure that the place survived. And he also recognized that if there was ever going to be a nuclear war in Europe, which in 1982 seemed a distinct possibility, and if the nuclear war consisted of just one explosion before people got a sense to stop it, that explosion would take place at this very location, because it is the choke point that would keep the Russian Navy from getting out into the Atlantic. And so he allowed there to be anti-nuclear festivals and so forth on the grounds. And the day that I was there and this great thing was happening, there must have been several thousand people there. And as you were walking around, you would notice that several of them, a dozen here, others over there, had strings and then little plastic bags that they had by their sides. And you would say to them, well, what's that about? And they said, I don't know, they just gave it to me when I came in. And you didn't quite know what was going on. And at 6 o'clock in the evening, the neighboring church, this is in August, so it's late, it's very late in Denmark, the sun goes down. It reminds me, I was in Iceland a few years ago, and I asked the lady at the rent-a-car agency, it was July, and I said, I want to drive from here, it's about 4 hours north, and will I be able to get back here before the sun sets? And she said, oh, this time of year, the sun doesn't set till September. And this is the same kind of thing in Denmark. But in any case, it was late summer evening, and the clock at the neighboring church struck 6, and you began to notice as you looked around, but it took about 5 minutes before you really began to notice that all sorts of people had just suddenly frozen. And you kind of, and then you began to notice that they were all the people with their bags. And this was by all kinds of people. It was farmers and kids and old people and people with briefcases, just all kinds of people. And then it took you a few minutes to realize that they weren't completely frozen. They were all beginning to orient themselves toward the water, and then they were beginning to move very, very slowly. And they began to form these files of people, and you don't see here in this, all the rest of us were off to the side kind of looking at this, my God, what's going on? And they just kind of were entranced horrifyingly, and they just kept slowly walking down the hill. The rest of us were looking at them from all over this place. And it wasn't until, by the way, I should also mention there's all kinds of things about this particular place. It is the narrowest place between Denmark and Sweden is, for that reason, the place where the rescue of the Danish Jews happened, from this harbor. In one night, all the Danish Jews were transited across to Sweden from Denmark, from that particular harbor. There's all kinds of fascinating things about this. It's, by the way, as I said, quite close to Hamlet's Elsinore Palace with to be or not to be. There's all kinds of resonance. In any case, they continued moving down the hill. And then it still came 45 minutes into the thing as a total shock when they just kept going. They just kept on going. It was a terrifying thing to watch. They were just going to drown themselves, it looked like. One of the most exciting things that happened, actually, that little boy over here in the white shirt, the water is very cold, and everybody's shaking violently as they're going in, and this one boy just kind of couldn't do it, and he started crying, and he leapt himself out of his stupor, and he ran to his grandmother, and it was like this great vision of hope, actually, strangely. And this had all kinds of powerful things. It was the creation of three performance artists named Billedstof Theater, which is picture theater. And they had just put an ad 6 months earlier, much in the way that you did your things, where and saying, do you want to be part of a demonstration or a piece that we're going to be doing at Louisiana? And just people from all walks of life had come together. And they just continued walking out there, and it was just, incredibly tremblingly shaking to look at this thing happening as they just continued. And it took them, 10 minutes to get all the way. And then what happened, by the way, is once they were in the water, they let go of the strings, and the black plastic bags kind of continued out into the water. In retrospect, the problem is that black plastic bags end up in the that was probably not a very good idea. But anyway, but what then happened, by the way, is it took well over an hour and a half, is they kind of came around underneath this dock and came up into the boathouse, and then Denmark being Denmark, everybody strips naked and they're given hot grog and they're all having a great time. But it was this incredibly powerful evocation through sleepwalking of how we need to wake up. And it seems to me there's all sorts of other examples of artists who've been doing this, but that is for me a model, and another model is out there, of the role of artists in waking us up. It seems, I think, that we generally are kind of stupefied with, going back to Jonathan Schell's notion, that we're so horrified at the prospect before us that we're almost stupefied into inaction, and it takes a huge leap of faith to imagine that the things that are coming at us can be averted. But I'd close with a beautiful passage from Ellen Willis, another one of our greatest American writers, and also, alas, passed away, and God, do we miss her. But Ellen Willis, back in the early 80s, during this same time, wrote, "The modernist once subversive refusal to be gulled or lulled has long since degenerated into a ritual despair, at least as corrupt, soft-minded, and cowardly, not to say smug, as the false cheer it replaced. The terms of the dialectic have reversed. Now the subversive task is to affirm an authentic postmodernist optimism that gives full weight to the existent horror and possible or probable apocalyptic disaster, yet insists credibly that we can, well, overcome. The catch is that you have to be an optimist, an American, she asks, in the first place, not to dismiss such a project as insane." I'll stop and give the sanity to you.
So my background's marine biology. I don't come from an art background, but obviously I appreciate its value for a number of reasons, but in particular this exhibit that we have outside I think is very useful in terms of providing an avenue for a local context for a conversation. And this is just a a picture of one of the reefs that's on an island that's just about 45 minutes, well, maybe an hour and a half. Depends on how fast you drive. Offshore from Abu Dhabi, sort of between Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Just to give you an example of the types of reefs that we have along our coastline. And I'd like to just briefly talk about the importance of the reefs here. So my entire lab is interested in looking at the Gulf as a model ecosystem to study climate change. And as you're aware, CO2 has been rising over the last number of decades. And you can see 1991, we put in Kyoto. That has had zero effect on carbon emissions. And this year, we've crossed the 400 mark. And this is the first time in over 800,000 years that we've crossed the 400 part per million mark. So, you know, we're not talking about just recent history. This goes back a long time. And so we're dabbling in a unique environment now, and one that we can't really predict very well. But, you know, we're here to talk about corals and coral reefs. I thought I'd give you just a little bit of biology as some context. So when you're out and you're diving on those reefs, like the one I just showed you, and you see these beautiful brown or green or orange corals, you're not actually looking at the coral. The coral itself is this little monster here. So each of those colonies that you have at the top is made up of many millions of polyps that are clones of one another, so they're genetically identical. And those polyps are basically the same material as a jellyfish, if you want to think of it that way. They're very close cousins. But they have a symbiotic relationship with an algae that floats around in the water that we call zooxanthellae. And these algae, you can see here, there's many millions of these little cells that are sitting inside of the coral tissue itself. And when you're looking at these guys, you're not seeing the coral. What you're seeing is the algae. But occasionally, these corals get under stress. And what happens is you go through a process that we now term bleaching, where the zooxanthellae, the algae, are expelled from the coral or digested by the coral. We're not quite sure on the mechanism yet. And you'll see corals paling and turning white. So this guy here, you can see there's some tissue that still has some color associated with it, but the remainder of it's turning white. And you can see this on large scale. So this is a picture from Dubai from several years ago during a particularly hot summer. These guys are what I would term blanching. They're not quite bleaching, but they're on the way there. And you can see some areas are approaching full white. And occasionally you'll see reefs that look like this. And this is a fully bleached reef. And at this point, they're like us. They get their food out of these algae, and they can go for a few days off of their fat stores without eating. But if they go for a period of 4 days, 7 days, something along those sorts of lines, without pulling those algae back in, if the conditions don't get better, those corals will starve to death. And you'll see that beautiful white reef, which is functionally a dead reef at this point, will completely die, and it'll overgrow with algae. So it's a very quick process. And this is something that's going on around the world, and it's been happening with increasing frequency and increasing magnitude over the last couple of decades. This is just to show you sort of the global scope of coral bleaching. And as a result of these bleaching events that have been happening, coral's gone into decline all around the world. Margaret was talking about this a little bit earlier, but there's some data there to show you that in some areas we've had over 50% reduction in the amount of live coral that we have on reefs. And you're looking here at the Caribbean and the Great Barrier Reef. And if you look at the projections for the future, we looked at the past CO2 emissions, and the projections into the future are not much better. Even with best case scenarios, we're still going to have an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. And because of the dynamics of that chemical in the atmosphere, even if we stopped emitting, it's still going to continue warming for a number of decades. So temperatures are predicted to increase by roughly 2 to 4 degrees over the coming decades. And as a result of this, we have a projection of loss in the future. That corals, as she was saying, by mid-century, in our literature, most people are looking at mid-1930s or 2030s. So comfortably in my children's lifetime, probably in my lifetime, we have the possibility that reefs as we currently know them could cease to exist. So that's the bad news. The larger question, though, is from my perspective as a biologist is, well, is there a possibility that corals could acclimate or adapt to this changing climate that we have? We're getting these doom and gloom pictures, and the question is, will reefs continue to look like this through some sort of adaptation, or will they look something like this, where you've got the coral skeleton is still there, but it's entirely dead and it's covered with algae at this point? And that's why I work here. So this is a wonderful university to work at, and we have fantastic students, and I also happen to have the luck of living on the doorsteps of the world's hottest sea. We have temperatures in the summertime that comfortably hit 35 degrees Celsius. And to put that sort of into context, if you took the Great Barrier Reef and you put it at 31 degrees Celsius, a lot of it would be dead, including the fish, not just the corals. So sitting at 35 degrees Celsius is well beyond the temperatures that are predicted for many other regions for at least a century with climate change. And this is just to give you an example of the, over a couple of different years, the temperatures that corals here are living through every summer. So it suggests that the doom and gloom may be a little too much doom and gloom. And if you actually looked at what corals here can tolerate versus in other areas, so these lines represent basically, on the bottom axis you have the temperature, and on the left-hand axis here you have how many days they can take at these different temperatures. And you can see that basically in the Great Barrier Reef or the Caribbean, pick any one of those locations there, they die very quickly at fairly low temperatures. None of them really doing well after 32 degrees Celsius. And if you look at the Arabian Gulf, we have corals that are surviving, in excess of 35 degrees for over a month, no problem. 35 degrees would nuke corals on all of these other reefs that are shown there. So for us, the Gulf represents an opportunity. It's a very unique ecosystem. We do have corals and coral reef fishes that are surviving here just off of our shoreline, and it's a valuable opportunity for science. And there's increasing recognition of this importance, and we've had a number of conferences where scientists are talking to other scientists. You heard a little bit about the details on this earlier. And in terms of the publications that have been coming out in the scientific literature, since 2002, we've doubled the number of publications that have come out, because it's only in the recent years that there's a recognition of the importance of this system. So things are increasing very quickly. And we have another conference that's coming up just in February, a few months from now, where we're looking not just at the Gulf itself, but the wider region, because this whole area is very interesting. The Gulf of Aden is actually one of the coldest reef environments in the world because of the upwelling that happens during the summer, and it's just next door. So it's a very interesting place to work from a biological perspective. But it's important to remember that this is a small, fairly isolated ecosystem. And this ecosystem is undergoing threats. And the reason for this is various, and we can talk about that perhaps a little bit later. And you're probably all familiar with many of the things that are threatening reefs here in the area. But just to give you a picture of where we are in the world, you can see here, this is data for the world, and we've lost roughly 20% of our reefs. So a fifth of our reefs have been lost worldwide because of natural forces or anthropogenic activities. But if you look at the Gulf itself, this is from a book by Clive Wilkinson, which basically talks about reefs worldwide. We've lost 70% of the reefs here just in the Gulf itself already. So this is a very important asset for science, but it's also ecologically important, and I can talk at length about that as well. And it's now considered to be amongst the most damaged reefs in the world. And just to show you what reefs around here look like, in case you're not familiar, this is what reefs, if you go just up towards the Musandam Peninsula outside of Ras Al Khaimah, you'll see reefs that look like this. And these are in areas, so that's in the far north. If you go offshore and you look at the islands, you'll see these big table corals surrounding them. So these are areas that are relatively distant from human development. This is an area near Dubai. But as you start to get closer to areas where human activity is a little bit higher, but also the environment itself is naturally more extreme as you get westward, you start seeing shifts in the communities that you have on these reefs. So you can see this reef here. This is Saadiyat, just offshore here. And you can see there's a lot of mound and brain corals there, but you don't have a lot of that three-dimensional structure. And there's this one very sad and lonely table coral off to the side. These guys are fairly sensitive, and so they're amongst the first to disappear. And as you go further west, this is in Butina, which is they were trying to propose it as a World Heritage Site a few years ago. You can see that the amount of coral has died off, and there's no table corals in that area. And as you go even further west, this is Al Yassat, which is sort of towards where the nuclear facility is, down towards the Qatar border. You can see basically here we've only got a little bit of live coral here and here, but this reef is entirely dead. Some of it has to do with natural forcings from climate change, if you want to consider that natural, and El Nino events. But there's also local impacts on this as well. And so, you know, exhibits like what we have outside do serve as valuable vehicle for talking about sort of the issues on a global scale, but I think it's also important to start a conversation here on the local scale in terms of what are some of the things that we could do as a community to encourage the conservation of these valuable ecosystems.
I wanted to just ask, and then we'll turn it to the audience in a little bit, but I just wanted to ask one question to everybody here. Ren was talking about the importance of the artist to kind of visualize and the importance of the sense of vision. And oftentimes in biology, we always refer to the structure, you know, the actual structure of different proteins or the structure of different, you know, biological molecules as having a direct relationship to the function that they have. I was wondering if Margaret and John and maybe Ren, you could comment a little bit about what makes, you know, because here in the exhibit, there's so much diversity, and you spoke a little bit, John, about these different three-dimensional, you know, coral reef and the relationship between the algae and the coral and polyps. But what determines these elaborate structures that are, you know, that basically are formed? And if you could talk a little bit also, Margaret, about how do these artists, you know, all of these women coming together and actually developing these crochet reef projects, do they do it based on scientific images? Do they discuss with scientists? How is that kind of translated into artwork?
Well, actually, I'd love.
Yeah, maybe we could start with John talking about the diversity. How do you explain those elaborate structures that we see?
Well, you know, it's one of those things, kind of like the community art project, actually, in that it starts with one small thing and builds up from there. Virtually all the organisms that you see on a coral reef, in terms of the corals themselves, they start off as a single-celled zygote, like we do, as an egg, and that settles down as a larvae at some point, and it starts off, generally, it's less than a millimeter. That 1 millimeter polyp will, you know, it'll turn into a polyp, and it will multiply and multiply into a colony at some point. And the reefs that you get, you know, you were talking earlier about the Great Barrier Reef, the largest reef on Earth, is the buildup of these over tens of thousands of years. So they lay down a skeleton, they grow, they lay down some more skeleton, they grow, and eventually these die off, just like anything else does, and something else will grow on top of it. So in most areas of the world, you get these building on each other, which develops into true reefs. And if you drill down through a reef, it's only the top centimeter, well, less than a centimeter even, that's actually alive. The rest of it's dead skeleton underneath. And around here, it's interesting because we don't actually have what are called true reefs. They don't build on each other. There seems to be the environment's just at the margins of tolerance for corals, so they tend to grow and then die off, and sometimes you'll get another one growing on top, but most times you don't. And so it's more of a coral carpet. You'll get one here, one there.
Can I ask you just a question? What's it like for you, as somebody who's thinking about this, to see what's going on in the town of Abu Dhabi? The reef that's taken, for that matter, this campus. I mean, talk about polyps. You know, I mean, there's this incredible reef-like explosion from all these little tiny people.
Well, I just wish it was a little more in touch with nature. That would be.
Although the campus center looks a little bit like a coral reef, that circular campus center in the middle. It has a bit of that reminiscence. Yeah.
Your question, Alexis, is a really interesting one, because in our reef we have a huge diversity of structures, and we are inspired by looking at pictures of real reefs. And obviously we don't feel compelled to be completely documentary, but it's interesting when you're crocheting these forms, by using very simple techniques, you can actually develop fundamentally new structural things. So I'll tell you a very simple example of it. If you start crocheting a tube, and then you start to sort of increase the width of the tube by doing hyperbolic crochet, it's a very simple technique, and then it gets bigger, and then you pinch it off in the middle, so you've got two branches of the tube, and then you go off in two directions, and you get these tree-like structures of John's. Now, it's a very interesting question. What we're doing with that is mimicking structures that exist in real life. But is what we're doing with our algorithms, is there, as it were, a genetic equivalent of this? And this is a question that I've asked a lot of coral reef biologists over the years, and the answer that I've got from them is that actually not much is known about this. So, for instance, in living reefs, as John was saying, all the heads of coral are built by millions of tiny individual polyps. But how is it that, like, when some bunches of corals get together, they form these staghorn structures, or some corals form brain coral structures, some form plate structures? How does the structure come into being, and how do all of the millions of little polyps collectively know to do this structure? Like, how do they know that I'm a staghorn coral and you're a brain coral and you're a plate coral? And as far as I can tell from talking to coral biologists, they don't really know this question.
You know, you've got some biology that goes into the body plan itself, just like we're, you know, bilaterally symmetrical. But in terms of, you know, looking at the skeleton of these guys that are on the bottom, why does it become the tip of the branch? This one is on the side, it has a slightly different morphology, and how the whole thing is controlled by something that doesn't even have a brain.
Is that similar, by the way, to stem cells in human beings? How do all the cells around the heart know to be a heart, and the ones around the brain to be a brain? And I mean, it's similar, and there's no brain that's making that happen.
Now, John, I had a question about kind of this collaboration or community kind of building of these reefs. Now, does it happen also that these reefs actually change shape over the course of their, you know, over the course of their existence and their evolution, or is it something that's established? Is it a bit like a neural network that, you know, they change partners over time, and there are certain things that change, a bit like the dunes in the desert, for example, or is it very rigid in terms of how they establish these connections?
It depends on the time scale that you're looking at. So, you know, on geological sort of time scales, these guys are popping in and out of existence. The reefs that we have on the coastline right here, so those individual corals, those branching corals, I'd guess those would be around 8 or 10 years old. And then you've got, if you look on a larger sort of time scale, you've got, and they will continue to grow. These ones are very fast growing, and you'll get other species that are this big, and they may be 15 or 20 years old, so much smaller. But then if you look at the Gulf itself, there was no corals here around 6,000 years ago. The coastline that we have now is new because it was all sand during the last glacial ice age. And so the sea level only stabilized around that point, around 6,000 years ago. And then even further afield, you can look, you can go to Iran or up in the Musandam Peninsula and look at reefs that were formerly sitting on the seabeds in those areas many millions of years ago that are now up in part of the geology along the coastline. And we're mining them to build breakwaters along the coast.
I wanted to broaden the conversation a bit about, you know, science and art and what are the ways of kind of bringing the message across. But I had one last question, Margaret, which is when you have these different artists actually making, you know, specific coral reef, do they speak to each other? Do they talk about how their specific structure is gonna fit into somebody else's structure, or are they all working? Because I would imagine that in a reef situation, all of these things are being kind of constructed simultaneously and constant discussion. How is the actual process of building this in terms of collaboration between these artists?
Well, it actually happens in sort of multiple layers, which is actually not dissimilar in some ways to the way that living reefs build. So, you know, each reefs are made from coral polyps, and as John said, millions of them acting together make a coral head, and then millions of coral heads make up a reef. So there's sort of multiple levels of structure happening. And a similar thing happens with the Crochet Reef project. So when we do it with a community, as it has been done here in Abu Dhabi, there is there's usually a core group of people who are, as it were, managing the whole project. And they teach workshops and teach the techniques to the people who come, who then go and teach it to others and go out. And then those people make their own corals in their own homes and bring them back into workshops. And sometimes a group of people will collaborate together on a bigger structure. Sometimes people will do their own bigger structure. Lots of people will just do individual things. And then at the end, the whole thing gets put together and has to be curated into the beautiful topological landscape that you see out there. And that too is a collective endeavour, which may involve anything from a couple of people to dozens of people who, as it were, make aesthetic decisions about, well, we'd like to have a red mound here and a white mound here. It's a very organic process. We basically give people some fundamental pointers about how to do this, but we want to see them express it themselves. So the whole process, just as evolution is open-ended and organic, and there's no, as it one mind, dictating how it will ultimately look. So these things are organic, living things.
Well, one thing that just listening to the two of you, I've been thinking is, I was talking about vision, and that vision is the domain of artists, but it's also, by the way, scientists. When a scientist is working, and when they make a breakthrough, they say, "Oh, I see." That is how it's experienced. It becomes clear. It was confusing before, but now suddenly it's clear, and that bringing into focus is something that goes across from artists to scientists, and it brings to mind, I was talking about this the other day here, that one of the great natural scientists of the 20th century, a Russian emigre butterfly scientist named Vladimir Nabokov, had a wonderful line where he said, "The true master needs the precision of the poet and the imagination of the scientist," which is a great quote when you think about it, because it seems like it's backwards. But in fact, the artist's portion is bringing things to a precise focus, and the scientist is the one who's delirious with imagination, and somehow together you get that.
Ren, I wanted to just bounce off, and then I'm going to open it up to everybody. I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there, but to talk a little bit about, you were talking about that in the face of all these kind of, inevitable kind of disasters and things that seem very hard to kind of harness, that we remain stupefied and we don't really know how to act. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your take on how artists and scientists can collaborate on, a lot of scientists always complain about science communication and about their ideas not coming across, but there's obviously an issue about how scientists communicate, but also the way science is portrayed in the media, never really focusing on scientific process, and as Ren was saying, the idea of just observation and empirical data, but it's always on these discoveries that oftentimes are wrapped in political agendas and controversial, and science is 90% process. And I was wondering, what are your ideas, including the Crochet Reef project, that you think could bring awareness to these kind of issues like climate change?
One of the things in the middle of your talk, John, I almost asked you, in fact I did ask you before, this is amazing that there are coral reefs here in the Gulf that are seen to be able to, you showed us, to live at temperatures way beyond what the Great Barrier Reef. Can we maybe take some of those to the Great Barrier Reef? Or could one imagine, instead of just this being purely a dour discussion, that indeed science would have ideas about how we're going to get through this pass? We were also talking, this isn't exactly what you're saying, but Walter Murch has this wonderful analogy about the current situation, where he talks about what it must be like to be inside of an egg from the chick's point of view. And so, it starts out as, a yolk and white, and gradually it becomes a chick, and it's getting bigger and bigger, and it's eating all the white as it's getting bigger. And he says, toward the end of that process, it must look pretty grim for the chick. I mean, there's no more food. He's surrounded by waste all around him. It's, and it's over. It's like, but then peck, peck,
Makes it through.
they break it into something much wider. And it seems to me that one of the things that might be a way of thinking about this, when he said that to me, say, yeah, they're born into an industrial chicken farm. But anyway, but it seems to me that it is one of the things that both artists and scientists can talk about is that there is a long, long history of life making it through by the skin of its teeth. I mean, this is not the first time things have looked horrible. People during the Black Plague must have thought it was pretty bad. You know, I mean, it seems impossible, and yet, I think the thing that you could say is, and you might agree with this, that the only way we're going to make it through is by things becoming much better than they are today. You know, that's going to be that we're going to have to reinvent, as Naomi Klein says, frankly, we're going to have to reinvent capitalism, we're going to have to reinvent all kinds of ways of living, and we're going to live much better, much less alienated life, or we'll perish. But the good news is there's such pressure on us that maybe we'll do it. And that is why, from my point of view, artists can both be, you know, waking you up, but also saying, look how beautiful everything is, you know. That's another thing artists do. Wake up to how beautiful it is, you know, and that in itself becomes a positive thing for trying to make things happen.
John, in addition to the exhibit that we have here, how is the information about what's happening in the Gulf, and how is that information about the coral reef and the bleaching? What, you know, obviously the scientists in the conferences that you're involved with, there's a lot of discussion about this, but how does it reach kind of the general audience?
Well,
and if you could talk a little bit about the...
Sure, I'll talk about it briefly, and then maybe we can...
And then we'll
open it
go
up
to questions, yeah.
Let some folks comment on this, because I'm curious what the public actually knows. You know, for us, we're basically incentivized to talk to other scientists. So my promotion is based on how many papers I get out, and they're always technical papers, and how many times those are cited by other scientists. And on our NSF applications or whatever grant you apply for, you have to put down where your public sort of involvement is. And almost every scientist that I know just puts stuff down and then never really follows up on it. So the incentives in science itself dissuade you from working with the public because it means less time for being in the lab and getting those things out which get you promoted. There is, particularly in the last decade, there has been a strong push for actual public engagement. I've seen great growth in both awareness and involvement here in the region in the last few years. When I first moved here, people didn't even, for the most part, didn't even know that there was reefs offshore. And now I have random people that are coming up to me and asking me about the reefs here and how they're doing. And you know, there's a general awareness, both of the existence, but also the condition of reefs around here. But you know, from our perspective, it's difficult because at least here in the region, we have a transient society. It's a multilingual, multicultural society. The people who make decisions are generally not in the public. So there's actually, if you think about it again from an incentive perspective, there's no point in talking to the public. You need to talk directly to the decision makers because societal involvement in decision making here is fairly limited. So it's an interesting sort of context to work in to try and get that science out there. And so, you know, we have, like we use Facebook and we have a website, and I published a couple of papers, one very recently on sort of the state of reefs here in the Gulf that are written for, you know, pop science basically, to try and get the word out. But, you know, I don't know where else to direct my efforts to really engage people in this conversation.
We should make some films. So, yeah.
Yes.
Could I just make a comment directly on this issue, because I actually came to this project from the point of view of being a science communicator. So my sister Christine is an artist, but I'm actually a science communicator, and the reason I started this project was because as a science writer and communicator, I was incredibly frustrated by the state of science communication. It's a little known and very undiscussed fact that the audience for most science communication, you know, science magazines, science documentaries, etc., is a fairly small sector of our society. In a nutshell, the primary audience for science, the primary audience that reads science communication is well-off white men over 40, and people in the higher socioeconomic brackets. That's not a value judgment. It's just a fact, and it's true all over the Western world. And I started the project because I wanted to have more innovative ways to communicate about science to a much wider audience, particularly to women. And I feel extremely proud of this project that 2 million people have seen these exhibitions at places like the Smithsonian, the Hayward, and here now. And that's all of those 2 million people. In every exhibition, there's information, as there is here, there's information about climate change, there's information about the mathematics behind it, there's information about coral bleaching. 2 million people have had some genuine education about climate change and marine biology, etc., through a project that, as one science program officer once dismissed to me, was just a bunch of women knitting. And I think we need to really think seriously. If we are serious about communicating science to the public, how can that be supported in ways that really engage people in more alive modalities?
I would say, ironically, it's science is that many, for example, TV series and film, that science actually is the core to many successful, that when it's done properly and it's wrapped up in a narrative, I think actually science becomes viral very quickly. And the idea that communicating science is there is kind of a standard way that people associate science communication. And I think that if you think about, a lot of the TV shows on, most of the popular ones are all science-based. And so it's just interesting when there's science talks and science events, even the whole kind of popularization of science through TED, for example, is incredible to see how viral that got. But anyway.
I just want to say one thing before we leave the point she was making, and she was being polite. It is a scandal how the science community has not supported this project. The Sloan, and let's name names, the Sloan Foundation, all the big science foundations dismiss it. This cannot be serious. This is generally not shown at science museums. If it's being shown at places, it's mainly art museums or universities, things like that. And
although it's been shown at the Smithsonian.
But it was a struggle to get it there.
Yeah.
I mean, I just as a reporter now, and I'm in my reporter thing, to watch what has happened, and it's a little bit the same point that you were making, that you don't get promoted. And by the way, the people in the room who are not promoting you are in this room.
Okay, let's open it up to questions.
Let's say specifically that has to change.
Right.
And it's got to change in academia. It's got to change in science bureaucracy and so forth. And it's one of the things it's becoming a matter of life and death that has to change. And people have to start thinking about it.
Good evening. First, a comment. I thought the talk was great. I really loved the marriage of science and art. I feel like I learned a lot. This question is directed, it was first going to be directed at John, but really now to everybody. As the three of you just spoke about this call to action, this greater awareness by the public for protection and conservation, what exactly does that look like to you? And I'm asking this as I'm a kindergarten teacher, and I've taught just all grades basically throughout my teaching career. And one of the things that I constantly vacillate back and forth between is what is appropriate awareness and how far do I go into educating children? What does that look like? And as I feel like each of you have expressed your frustrations with the lack of action. What is it that you would like to see? Because I hear you're saying not enough is being done, but what would that look like? What would enough or something being done look like?
And specifically in kind of your area.
Well, in my experience as a science communicator, one of the great issues that we face is climate change is a scary topic, scary on so many levels. One of the ways that it's scary is that we have to change our own behaviour, each one of us. And people tend to feel really powerless when they see reports coming out, the kind of figures that John's just shown us. And I think what we need to do, as Ren was alluding to before, is how can we make people feel not powerless? The science studies scholar Donna Haraway puts it beautifully. She says, we have to find ways not to give in to the techno-tragic problem of a future that is dictated to us. We need to find ways to give people the sense that we do have an open future, that we can determine it for ourselves. It is not pre-given. And I don't think that's an easy question, but we somehow have to find ways to communicate the urgency of the problem, but giving people a sense of hope. And that's actually the thing that I feel is going on with the Reef project. Because it's the Crochet Reef project, because people get to build something themselves, it's literally constructive, not destructive. And I think that's a key thing. We need to find ways to allow people's constructivity, the better aspects of themselves, to come to the fore.
And just to go on from that, for myself, there's two elements of this. There's the carrot and the stick. And the, trying to affect change on a short-term sort of scale is basically punitive. So getting legislation, policy put in place that deals with sort of issues in the environment. But to me, the things that are most successful are actually educational, and starting from basically the group that you're working in. If you think about the green movement in North America, that was sort of after Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came out, and it's grown from there. And it took periods of decades. And so we're looking at it from a myopic sort of view of our own baseline. That's what I grew up in. I'm environmentally friendly and so on and so forth. But again, we've got a group of people here that are coming from all over the world with different backgrounds. And I think it's important to try and get the educational system here more involved in environmental issues. I don't know, like you're an educator, not myself, at the lower levels. So I don't know how much discourse there is in the classrooms on these sort of issues. I know kids are passionate about the environment, and as that grows, turning that passion into action. So, my parents didn't throw stuff out the window because they'd get a fine. I didn't throw stuff out the window because I didn't want to throw stuff out the window. And I think it's that sort of decadal scale that things have to happen.
In terms of the history of art, and it's interesting to realize that a few minutes ago I mentioned the way that the abolition movement led directly to the feminist movement, which is to say that all these women who had been organizing to liberate the slaves said, wait a second, we're being treated like slaves, and so forth. In the same way, it's interesting that the feminist movement and the environmentalist movement arise simultaneously. The key date is 1970, with the invention of Earth Day. The first Earth Day is 1970. And that is exactly as Ms. Magazine is being founded, and so this is part of what's fascinating here. And many of the really, really terrific artists in this terrain, Tara Donovan, Ronnie Horn, and so forth, are women. One thing specifically that came to mind when you asked the question about school children, I had a strange experience many years ago. There was in junior high school in my town, there was a pop quiz given to the 12-year-olds on the question, why are humans on this planet? What is the purpose of human life? And one 12-year-old girl, who we will call my daughter Sarah, who some of you know, who used to be a gaff here, when she was 12, I got called in by the teacher, and she had written the following phrase. I don't know where this came from, but I believe that there is, despite the fact that we humans have done so much damage to the world, a reason for our existence on this planet. I think we are here because the universe, with all its wonder and balance and logic, needs to be marveled at. And we are the only species, to our knowledge, that has the ability to do so. We are the one species that does not simply accept what is around us, but also asks why it is around us and how it works. We are here because without us here to study it, the amazing complexity of the world would be wasted. And finally, we are here because the universe needs an entity to ask why it is here. Try that out in the kindergarten class. I mean, in some particular sense, that is the joy of being young and being and so forth.
I just wanted to add as well, in the scientific community, there's a big movement that's spreading right now, which is DIY biology, where scientists are leaving the labs and doing science outside of the lab. And there's, for example, in New York, there's an organization called GenSpace, where there's many projects where scientists and artists collaborate. And so I think there's also kind of that push in kind of activism with scientists doing work outside of the lab.
My question is to Dr. John. Sir, would you like to throw a little more light on how exactly the deep-seated coral health affects the human life? Because we all know that actually deforestation, how it affects actually because what the plants give. But what is the relation between a deep-seated coral health and human life?
So I won't limit this. You were saying deep sea corals? Corals in general. Yeah. So, well, if you look at it just from an economics perspective, it's been estimated by various economists that they're worth something on the order of $400 billion a year in goods and services that they're providing humanity. And so the obvious ones are things like fisheries, but then ones that are less obvious, like building materials around atolls, coastal protection, again, around atolls, very common, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of goods and services that are provided by these things. And if you look at, in particular in the developing world, which is where most coral reefs occur, many countries, if you take, for example, the Philippines, gets 20% of its diet off of these reefs. So they're varied in terms of their importance for humans, aside from just the diversity of these beautiful ecosystems. They make up 1% of the sea bottom and contain 25% of all marine species. So they're diverse, they're important for us, they're important for a lot of different reasons.